Welcome to True Crime Talks. Today we uncover the tragic story of Helen, a woman whose life was stolen by abuse and silence. In the quiet town of Marshwood, life moved at a slow, predictable pace, with little to disturb its unassuming charm. But beneath its surface, the town harbored secrets that no one dared to speak about. Helen, a 22-year-old woman with a bright smile and a kind heart, found herself at the center of one such secret when her life took an unexpected and devastating turn. A misunderstanding with her employer led to accusations of theft, and despite her pleas of innocence, she was arrested. With no resources to fight back and no one to vouch for her, Helen was sentenced to serve time in the county jail, a grim, isolated building on the edge of town. The jail, known for its dilapidated condition and eerie silence, was a place of whispered stories and hidden fears. Helen was assigned to a cell at the far end of the corridor, away from the minimal activity that the facility saw. It was a space that felt removed from the world, where the dim lighting and cold walls seemed to sap the spirit of anyone confined within. Ramon, a 28-year-old deputy jailer, was tasked with overseeing Helen's confinement. At first glance, he appeared professional, a man of authority and routine. His demeanor gave little away, and Helen, though apprehensive about her situation, initially thought him to be just another cog in the system. However, Ramon harbored a darkness that was not immediately visible, a dangerous obsession that few in the town suspected. Helen's presence in the jail did not go unnoticed by the other inmates. They exchanged glances and muttered warnings whenever Ramon passed by her cell, their faces a mix of pity and fear. Helen's unease grew as she began noticing Ramon's frequent visits to her cell block, his watchful gaze lingering longer than it should. He often stood in silence just outside her cell, as if assessing her every move. She tried to ignore him, focusing on keeping herself composed, but the atmosphere in the jail was oppressive, and a gnawing sense of dread settled in her chest. The isolation was unbearable, but it was the whispered warnings from other inmates that truly unsettled her. "Be careful," they muttered when Ramon was out of earshot. "Stay quiet. Don't make him angry." Helen didn't understand the full weight of these words, but she could feel the tension in their voices. It wasn't long before the pieces began to fall into place. Ramon's presence, once seemingly routine, now felt menacing. His lingering glances, his authority, and the silence of those around her painted a picture of a man who wielded his power in ways no one dared to confront. Helen's fear grew, but she had no one to turn to. Chris, a senior officer, avoided her eyes whenever she tried to speak to him, his own fear palpable. In this isolated, oppressive environment, Helen realized that she was utterly alone, at the mercy of a system designed to suppress rather than protect. As the days turned into weeks, Helen's unease grew into full-blown terror. Her instincts warned her that something sinister was unfolding, but she felt powerless to stop it. Ramon, once seemingly distant and professional, began to focus his attention on her in ways that made her skin crawl. At first, his actions were subtle, small gestures that might have seemed considerate to an outsider but carried an undercurrent of control. He brought her extra food when others went without and granted her longer breaks outside her cell, always under his watchful eye. These supposed acts of kindness were laced with a chilling implication she owed him for these favors. Late one night, Helen's worst fears were realized when Ramon entered her cell under the guise of a routine check. His demeanor was different, calm but predatory. He lingered far longer than necessary, his presence oppressive and overwhelming. Helen froze, unsure of how to react. Any resistance might provoke him, but compliance felt like surrendering her humanity. Over the next few nights, these visits became more frequent. Ramon didn't try to justify his actions, nor did he speak much. His authority was his excuse, and his silence was a weapon. Helen quickly realized she had no allies within the jail. Desperate, she tried to seek help from Chris, the senior officer. One afternoon, when she managed to catch him alone near her cell, she attempted to explain what was happening, but Chris wouldn't meet her eyes. His face tightened with discomfort as he muttered something about being unable to get involved. It was clear he knew, but fear of Ramon, of repercussions, of losing his job kept him silent. Helen felt her hope slipping away, piece by piece. Meanwhile, the other inmates avoided her, their expressions a mix of pity and self-preservation. They had seen this pattern before. Helen wasn't the first, and unless something changed, she wouldn't be the last. One inmate whispered to her during a rare moment of courage, "Don't fight him, or he'll make it worse." The words echoed in Helen's mind, a cruel reminder of the futility of her situation. Deborah, a nurse who occasionally visited the jail, noticed the changes in Helen. Her once vibrant spirit seemed to have been replaced with a hollow, haunted look. The bruises on her arms and her refusal to make eye contact set off alarm bells. Deborah tried to coax Helen into talking, but her questions were met with silence. Helen couldn't trust anyone, not when Ramon's shadow loomed over every corner of the jail. Each night, the anticipation of Ramon's visits grew unbearable. Helen's mind raced with possibilities, none of them offering a way out. The walls of her cell felt like they were closing in, suffocating her. She thought about screaming, about fighting back, but the whispered warnings of the other inmates replayed in her mind. There was no one to protect her, no one willing to stand up against Ramon's unchecked power. Helen's condition continued to deteriorate as the relentless cycle of abuse left her both physically and emotionally drained. She barely ate, and her once vivid eyes now seemed lifeless. The hope she clung to when she first entered the jail had been replaced with a deep, gnawing despair. Ramon's control over her life felt absolute, and every passing day made escape seem more impossible. The bruises on her body told one part of the story, but the far more profound scars were the ones no one could see, the ones buried deep within her. Deborah, the jail's visiting nurse, grew increasingly concerned. The change in Helen's demeanor was undeniable, and her silence spoke volumes. Helen's body language, the way she flinched at sudden movements or avoided eye contact, hinted at a deeper trauma. Deborah began to suspect that Ramon, the ever-present figure in the jail, might be involved. She had heard unsettling rumors about him before, whispers from former inmates and quiet complaints from staff members, but none had ever been formally reported. Deborah decided to keep a closer eye on Helen, even if she couldn't immediately act on her suspicions. Then, one day during a routine health check, Helen slipped Deborah a folded piece of paper. Her hands trembled as she handed it over, her eyes darting to the door to ensure no one was watching. Deborah hesitated for a moment before slipping the note into her pocket, her heart pounding. When she later unfolded it in the privacy of her car, her worst fears were confirmed. The note detailed Ramon's relentless abuse, the threats he used to keep Helen silent, and her growing fear that she wouldn't survive if nothing changed. The words were desperate, pleading, and filled with a sense of finality that shook Deborah to her core. Determined to act, Deborah reached out to a former colleague, a contact in the state's corrections department, and relayed Helen's story. She emphasized the urgency of the situation, insisting that someone intervene before it was too late. However, word of her inquiry somehow reached the sheriff's office. Deborah was warned to stay away from the jail and was barred from her nursing visits under the pretense of security concerns. It was a blatant attempt to silence her, but she wasn't about to back down. Meanwhile, Helen's isolation grew unbearable. Without Deborah's visits, she had no outlet, no one to confide in. Ramon noticed the change and seemed emboldened by it. His visits became more frequent, his threats more explicit. Helen tried to remain strong, but the constant fear was eroding her will. Her attempts to confide in the other inmates were met with the same fearful silence she had encountered before. They had their own survival to think about and couldn't risk drawing Ramon's attention. Trapped and desperate, Helen began to think about escape. She couldn't count on anyone to save her, so she started planning ways to save herself. Her first attempt was a small act of defiance, hiding a sharp piece of metal from the food trays. It wasn't much, but it was the only weapon she could think to use. She had no clear plan, only the hope that she could somehow use it to free herself from her cell or protect herself if Ramon came again. But deep down, she knew her chances were slim. Her situation felt hopeless, and the darkness around her was closing in. One fateful night, after weeks of enduring Ramon's abuse and manipulation, Helen reached her breaking point. The oppressive silence of the jail was broken only by the distant hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional shuffle of a guard making their rounds. It was during this stillness that Helen decided she had no choice but to act. She couldn't wait for someone to save her. No one was coming. Her sharpened piece of metal, hidden beneath her mattress, was her only hope. She clutched it tightly, her hands shaking as she worked on the lock to her cell. The sound of the metal scraping against the mechanism echoed in the empty corridor, and every small noise sent her heart racing. She knew the risk if she was caught. The punishment would be severe, but staying meant inevitable ruin. After what felt like an eternity, the lock clicked open. Helen pushed the cell door slowly, her movements careful and deliberate to avoid making any noise. She glanced down the hallway, her pulse quickening as she calculated her next steps. Her plan was simple but desperate. She would find a way out, no matter what. The air felt heavier as she moved cautiously toward the exit, her senses on high alert. For a brief moment, hope flickered within her, a small, fragile light in the overwhelming darkness. But her escape attempt was short-lived. Ramon, ever watchful, caught her just as she reached the corner leading to the main hallway. His sudden appearance made her heart stop. The look on his face wasn't just anger, it was fury, a terrifying mix of rage and authority. Helen froze, her breath hitching as she realized there was no way out. Ramon grabbed her arm with brutal force, dragging her back toward her cell. The piece of metal she had clung to fell to the floor with a soft clang, her last chance slipping away. Back in her cell, Ramon's anger boiled over. His wrath was swift and unrelenting, a cruel punishment for her defiance. Helen's screams echoed through the empty jail, but no one came to help. The other inmates remained silent, too afraid to intervene. The violence that night was worse than anything she had endured before. When Ramon finally left her cell, Helen was barely conscious, her body battered and broken. By morning, the jail was eerily quiet. When the guards made their rounds, they found Helen unresponsive in her cell. The official report claimed she had taken her own life, citing the pressures of incarceration as the cause. But the bruises on her body and the fear in her lifeless eyes told a different story, one that was far darker. Word of Helen's death spread quickly, and whispers of what had really happened began to circulate. Deborah, devastated by the news, felt a crushing sense of guilt. She had tried to help, but it hadn't been enough. Determined to uncover the truth, she leaked the note Helen had given her to the press, exposing Ramon and the systemic failures within the jail. What had happened to Helen could no longer be ignored, but for her, justice had come far too late. Helen's death sent shockwaves through the small town of Marshwood, igniting outrage and suspicion among those who had quietly tolerated the injustices hidden within the walls of the county jail. The official report claimed suicide, a convenient conclusion that allowed the authorities to distance themselves from any responsibility. However, the bruises on Helen's body and her withdrawn, terrified demeanor in the days leading up to her death raised questions that the report couldn't answer. Rumors of abuse, corruption, and cover-ups swirled as Helen's tragic story began to unravel. Deborah, devastated by the loss of Helen, refused to let her death be swept under the rug. The note Helen had written, detailing Ramon's abuse and her fears, became the cornerstone of a fight for justice. Deborah anonymously leaked the note to a local journalist, ensuring its contents reached the public. The document painted a horrifying picture of life inside the jail, sparking outrage within the community. Protests erupted, with citizens demanding an investigation into the jail's practices and the people in charge. The town's long-standing apathy toward the jail's dark reputation was finally beginning to crumble. As pressure mounted, state authorities launched an investigation. Ramon was suspended from his position and eventually arrested, facing charges of sexual assault, abuse of power, and ultimately murder. The investigation also implicated Chris, the senior officer who had ignored Helen's pleas for help. His silence had allowed Ramon to continue his reign of terror unchecked, and he too was brought to account for his inaction. The trial was a spectacle that divided the town. Some believed justice was finally being served, while others, influenced by Ramon's defense team, argued that he was a victim of false accusations and a biased system. Ramon's lawyers portrayed him as a man under immense stress, claiming his actions were exaggerated or misinterpreted. They pointed to the lack of direct witnesses and tried to cast doubt on Deborah's credibility, suggesting she had fabricated the story for personal gain. Despite these efforts, the evidence against Ramon was overwhelming. Helen's note, coupled with testimonies from other former inmates who came forward during the investigation, painted a damning picture of systemic abuse. The trial also revealed years of negligence within the jail's administration, exposing a pattern of ignoring complaints and protecting those in power. The verdict was clear: Ramon was found guilty on multiple counts and sentenced to life in prison. Helen's death became a rallying cry for prison reform and the protection of vulnerable inmates. Deborah, haunted by the role she played in Helen's story, dedicated herself to advocacy work, fighting for the rights of incarcerated women and pushing for oversight in the justice system. She ensured that Helen's name would not be forgotten, speaking out in interviews and at rallies, sharing the truth about what happened behind the jail's walls. Yet, for all the justice that was served, the story left a lingering bitterness. The investigation unearthed more questions than answers about how many others had suffered in silence, their stories buried alongside Helen's. The sheriff's office implemented changes, but trust in the system had been irreparably damaged. Helen's story became a symbol of a broken system, a stark reminder of what happens when power is abused and silence is used as a shield. Though Ramon was punished and the town began to reckon with its dark secrets, the victory felt hollow. For Helen, justice had come too late. Her story, however, lived on, a somber warning to those who might turn a blind eye to the suffering of others. It was a tragedy that could never be undone, but one that forced a community, and perhaps a nation, to confront its failures.